Hey everyone, and welcome back to the third ECG vlog, I believe this is. This ECG vlog is going to be all about axis deviation. So the question posed, without any clinical information, what is the electrical axis of this 12 lead? And for those that answered leftward axis, congratulations, got that one right. So this quick video, hopefully, is going to be a little bit about just a rapid method to identify axis deviation. Hopefully spend no more than 30 seconds looking at it. And then in the following videos, we'll go ahead and talk about what some of the differential diagnoses are for what a leftward axis means, rightward axis, and the no man's land axis. And so in order to start, we have to talk about what is an electrical axis. And the basic definition of it is it's going to be a sum of all the electrical impulses in the heart. Now, the reason that the axis kind of extends normally from the direction of the right, starting at the right atrium and extending down into the left ventricle, is because the ventricles tend to generate most of the electrical potential in our heart. That is the thicker muscle area, and if there's more muscles contracting, then we're getting more electrical discharge in that direction. And so we can further subdivide that down, and we can look at the thickness of the ventricular wall, and we know that the left ventricle is much thicker than the right ventricle, and because of that, the left ventricle is going to generate more of an electrical potential, and that's going to tend to pull that mean electrical axis towards the direction of the left ventricle. So, as you guys can see from the red arrow there, as you can see from the bottom of the right atrium, kind of at the AB node level, that arrow extends down towards the apex, but tends to lean a little bit more towards the left ventricle. And the reason for that is because of the left ventricular thickness, larger size, more muscle cells, and therefore more of an electrical potential steering the electrical axis in that direction. So when we talk about an electrical axis, most of the time when we have a patient on a 4-lead, we're going to go ahead and monitor them on lead 2. And why is that? That's because of Einthoven's triangle. And remember this crazy triangle, right, where we have our right arm to our left arm down to our left leg. And the reason that we monitor lead 2 is, as you guys can see, is that it most closely parallels that mean electrical axis. So this is the reason why on a 4-lead, typically all the monitors are just preset to lead 2 unless you go in and manually change it. And the reason for this is because, like I said, lead 2 is most closely parallel to that mean electrical axis. And so also, for a fun fact, the right leg lead is not included in the Einthoven triangle because that is the ground lead for the electrical circuit. So if you popped off or right leg lead accidentally came off of the cardiac monitor, you typically will still get a rhythm that's generated, but otherwise the right leg is just for the ground lead. But once we obtain a 12 lead for that patient, our electrical axis looks a little bit more confusing. We start to get a bunch of arrows that extend in different directions. We get a lot of numbers that start to come up, whether positive or negative, and admittingly, this is frightening for me. I don't tend to look at the numbers to identify the axis deviation. I use a much simpler method where I just bubble in a circle, and where they overlap is where my axis deviation is. And so how I do that is I just simplify this down and I look at exclusively lead 1 and AVF. And so when I draw a circle around this next picture will kind of show where my axes tend to fall. So the leftward axis in the top right corner, extreme right axis there, rightward axis there, and then normal axis in the bottom right corner. And so how do I end up going about getting these values is when I look at lead 1, and remember from that Einthoven triangle, lead 1 was looking across the top, right? It was from our negative right arm lead to our positive left arm lead. And if I look at the QRS complex in lead 1 and it is a negative deflecting QRS, then I shade that half of that circle that corresponds to the negative side. And then if I have a positive deflection, then I would shade the positive side. So lead 1 separates my circle into right and left halves. Now when I look at AVF, I do the same exact thing. If I have a negative deflecting AVF, then I would shade the top half, which corresponds to the negative side. And then if it's a positive deflecting QRS, then I would shade the bottom half, which corresponds to the positive end. So the most difficult aspect of this axis deviation is just kind of remembering in which direction the positive and negative leads correspond to. And then the areas that they tend to overlap is the area where my axis falls for that specific 12 lead. And so we can go over some practice examples to kind of put this practical application to use. And so when we look at this 12 lead, remember we are focusing on lead 1 and lead AVF with a negative deflection in lead 1 and a positive deflection in AVF. We bring our circle back. Just remember lead 1 is looking at negative right arm to the positive left arm. Here's the 12 lead just as a reminder. Remember we're down in 1, up in AVF. So we have a negative deflection in lead 1, so we shade the negative side. In AVF, we had a positive deflection, so we shade the positive side, and where they overlap on that circle would be a rightward axis. Next 12 lead, we have up in 1 and down in AVF. So if we bring back our circle, we had a positive deflecting QRS in lead 1, so we shade the positive side. In AVF, we had a negative deflection, so we shade the negative end, and then where they overlap is in the space of the leftward axis. So looking at this scary 12 lead, we have a negative deflection in 1 and a negative deflection in AVF. Looking at lead 1, we had a negative deflection. In AVF, we had a negative deflection, so we shade the negative side, and where they overlap is no man's land. Some people tend to use this to help rule in ventricular tachycardia. Just like every rule in medicine, not everything is 100%, but some people tend to, no man's land is kind of a guaranteed ventricular tachycardia for them. So not always the case, but as a general rule, it can help steer you in the direction of ventricular tachycardia. Looking at the final 12 lead, we have kind of the reverse of the last. We have up in 1 and up in AVF, and by process of elimination, we have up in 1 and we have up in AVF, so we shade the positive side, and this is our normal axis. And so I hope that this kind of helped break down a quick and easy method to identify an axis deviation. And like I said, the hardest part is kind of remembering what left, right, and no man's land, where they end up in the circle, and which side is positive and negative. And next week we will kind of touch a little bit more on what causes each of these leftward or rightward or no man's land axes. So hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks, guys.